Whether we like it or not, the world seems to be moving more and more towards distance education, whether it's online learning at a university or K through 12 education system, whether it's learning in a flipped classroom environment, whether it's distance education that a college or university has to implement because of some kind of a disaster, or just because our companies are moving to online trainings. We have to learn a lot more in environments like this, where we're watching a video instead of being in a classroom with the professor. And that can be hard for a lot of us. We're used to learning in a traditional environment with students at the desks, a professor behind the lectern, and a traditional lecture being delivered. But there's a lot of benefits from online learning if we will take the time to learn how to do it properly. And what I want to share with you in this segment and a couple more that will be coming up later is how we can most succeed in an online setting. You see, I've taught online for over a dozen years. And I've found through my own experience, what I've heard from my students, and the literature in academic studies about distance education, is that there are some ways to make this experience at least as powerful, and in some cases even more powerful, than a traditional education. And I want to share with you what those ideas are and how you can best use them to move forward and be successful in an online environment. Specifically, I want to talk about these three things. First, how we get the most from an online lecture. Second, how to effectively study for a test. And finally, how to improve your grade on a multiple choice test. Now, the good news is that all the tips and techniques that we're going to talk about over these next few segments work almost as well in an on-campus setting as they do in an online setting. So whether you're doing traditional education or online education, these ideas will help. Before we get into the ideas though, let's talk about just online education in general. You see, most of us feel like online lectures and online education is a waste of time. We want to be in that classroom with our professor where we can ask questions. But there's also some benefits from online education. And while we could talk about a bunch, I just want to highlight two. The first is the flexibility of watching the lectures. You know, we tend to think when I go to class, I focus on the professor, I'm there and I'm learning, and I've set aside that 50 minutes, that hour, that 75 minutes, whatever it is, to just learn. And I'm focused and I get it. But the truth is, our brains don't work that way. Our brains can only focus on things for 5 to 10 minutes, and then they need a break to process what we've learned and to reset so that they can learn the next thing. And for some of us, it's even shorter than that 5 to 10 minutes. Depends on what you're learning and how interested you are. But you probably know this from your own time in a classroom setting because every once in a while you'll look out the window or you'll focus on that loose button on the professor's shirt or somebody walks by the door playing loud music and you are focusing on the music instead of the professor. And then you'll remember, oh, I'm supposed to be listening and taking notes, and you'll go back to paying attention. In an online setting when my brain needs a break, I can pause that video. I don't have to sit there and listen for a full 50 or 75 minutes to get all the material. I have control. The second big benefit of an online lecture is the ability to review material. You can't do that in a traditional lecture. Once the professor is done, that's it. Class is over and you got whatever you could in your notes. But if it's an online lecture, you can rewatch the parts that you're not comfortable with. You can go back and review. You can realize, oh, you know what? I didn't get all of that. Let me watch it again. And that provides a really significant benefit to learners. So while we all may prefer traditional classrooms, there is some significant benefits that we can derive from learning online. Now, how do we make the most of those videos? Well, we're going to talk about 3 ways that you can get the most out of an online lecture. But before we do that, we do have to talk just a bit about how your brain learns. And that brings us to what we call Bloom's taxonomy. What Bloom's does is it walks through how your brain learns. So we start with the very most basic level, and that's simply remembering facts, ideas, concepts, etc. When we know something a little bit better, we don't just memorize it, but we understand it. We know how it works and how the pieces fit together. The next level is being able to apply what we remember and how we understand it to specific scenarios and settings. The next level is being able to analyze. How well is it working? What problems are there in the process? How do different pieces fit together? Next, we're able to evaluate. Does this work well? Would something work better? Is it right? Is it wrong? And the final level is to create your own explanation, your own process. You can take all of the different pieces, pull them together in order to create something of your own. Now, all of our brains work this way. I like to ask my students this: would you work harder to make an A on an exam, or to teach a chapter to the class? Here's what my students say. And chances are many of you answered the same way, that you would work harder to teach a chapter than you would to study for a test. Why? Well, we tend to think it's because of the embarrassment factor. But the truth is, the reason so many people focus on teaching over making an A is because of the way our brain has to get ready for those two activities. To do well on a test, we have to remember information, understand it, and apply it. To be able to teach a concept, not only do we have to do those bottom levels, but we also have to be able to create our own explanations, decide what's most important, analyze our students' needs, etc. Now, where were you in high school? Most of the time, my students focus on these two levels, and specifically on remember, because a lot of high schools, junior highs, etc., are focused on getting you ready for a standardized test, ACT, SAT, whatever it is. Because of that, it's a lot of remembering of basic facts and hopefully understanding how they fit together. But a lot of people walk out of those kinds of situations and they feel like they haven't learned anything. Because when we focus on remembering and basic understanding, we don't really internalize and learn things. Which brings us to our next important question, and that is, where do you think the recruiters want you to be when they hire you? And when I ask my students this, most of them say, well, I expect us to be up here at the top. But evaluating, creating, analyzing, those are things that the bosses do. People with lots of experience. Where they really want us, when we first get started, is to be able to apply what we've learned and to analyze and learn more. And then over time, they will train us to move up towards evaluation and creation. But it's important in whatever educational setting we are to understand that we're supposed to be moving from remember and understand up towards analyze and apply. That's the goal. So with that in mind, we get the most out of our online education, or any education, if we can kick our brain into higher levels of thinking. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing is to focus on how you take notes. A lot of us can type so fast that we can actually capture every word that the professor says. But that isn't even remember. I'm just recording verbatim everything that's gone on. Where we really have power in learning is if we decide what is important enough to include in our notes. Then we're listening to what the professor is saying, but we're also analyzing what is more important. So that's kicked us up from just basic remember and understand up to analyze. And again, as we move higher up on Bloom's taxonomy, we remember better. Which brings us to our next technique for succeeding in an online lecture, and that is to give it a try. Most trainers or professors, as they go through the material, will stop and ask questions. And they seem rhetorical. What do you think about that? How do you think that works? Why would that be important? In technical topics like accounting, I stop every once in a while and say, let's try that. And we do an example or a problem. And in videos, when we do that, we ask the question and we go right on and give the answer. And just watching us give the answer doesn't really cue in your brain. So how do we fix that? Well, if you stop and try something, you're moving yourself into apply. Now, if we're talking about a conceptual question, you'll know enough to answer that conceptual question. But if we're talking about a problem, math, economics, statistics, accounting, finance, these more technical topics, chances are you won't get it right the first time you try a problem. And we don't like that. We don't want to feel like we don't know what we're doing. But what we've learned is when you try something on your own and then listen to the answer to decide if you've done it right or not, you actually move up to evaluate and analyze. It works kind of the same way as riding a bicycle. You only have to fall down a couple of times before your body learns how to avoid falling down. The same is true for any kind of problem or concept or question. If you answer it wrong and then take the time to figure out why you did it wrong, you'll never forget again. It's one of the most powerful memory techniques out there. So give it a try. Pause that video, try the problem, and you'll actually do a lot better at remembering what's gone on in that lecture. The final tip comes from years and years of research on education and on newer research on how our brain works. You see, Pixar's Inside Out, they had it right. Our brain creates memories of everything that happens to us. But if we don't care about it and we don't think about it, the brain gets rid of that memory to save space and energy for creating new memories that we do care about. It has to do with dendrites and neurons, and we won't get into all of that. But it's true, that's how the brain works. So if you learn something once and don't think about it again, your brain forgets it. It says, oh, that's not important. Let me just clear that memory out and save some space. So if you want to really learn something and remember it for the test or for your work after you graduate, etc., you have to think about it multiple times to convince your brain that it's important to you. So how do we do that? Well, that's where review, revise, and repeat comes in. Every once in a while, we want to go back and look at our notes and review them. Now, do you have to spend a lot of time on this? No. You can literally take 5 or 10 minutes every couple of days, review the notes, because going through and deciding whether I remember something and thinking through it again hits most of the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, I share these ideas with my students every semester, and some of them use them, some of them don't. And the ones that don't seem to ignore them because they seem too easy, too simple. How could that possibly work? Where's the gimmick? Where's the trick? The truth is there is no trick. Our brains are programmed to learn. All we have to do is learn enough about how they learn to convince them to retain information and make the connections that will help us use that information throughout our lives and careers. And that's what these 3 things will do. And now, as we move forward into our next segments, we'll talk about how we use these tips and tools and these great memories to help us do better on tests. We'll see you next time. Thanks.